Buddhism, which is not to equate any of those things. They're all different. That our motivation for doing this work ultimately is love of life, and that anger is an appropriate emotion to react to the threats of human dignity, which we're all facing. Anger is not appropriately directed at each other, however, and it's not directed appropriately, I don't believe, at all of the people who are seeking some meaning in life right now and who are finding it in that which I'll call for the moment the religious right. We're not going to be in consensus among us on all points today, and I don't think that we need to be. I had a powerful experience this spring where I was in a group. We were going to embody the stations of the cross for Easter. We're going to have 14 stations embodying human suffering now. And what happened was this person embodying censorship and the pain of censorship, and the person embodying child sexual abuse got into a huge fight, dragged everybody into it, and the whole thing was canceled. And I use that as an example of, I say coalition building should be another station of the cross. Because it's hard work. It is hard work. And so I don't mean to minimize the pain of the differences that any of us will have today, but simply to say we're not here to build consensus. We're here to build coalition. And Hans, John from here on my right, will be talking a lot more about that. And that, to my mind, is the most effective thing that we can do right now, is build coalitions with each other. In the spring of 1992, Pat Robertson wrote, "The strategy against the American radical left should be the same as General Douglas MacArthur employed against the Japanese in the Pacific. Bypass their strongholds, then surround them, then blast the individuals out of their power bunkers with hand-to-hand combat. The battle for Iwo Jima was not pleasant, but our troops won it. The battle to regain the soul of America won't be pleasant either, but we will win it." They know, the leadership of this agenda knows that separately none of us have any power, and that is why, to my mind, we build coalitions with each other. We can't do this work alone, which is why I'm so excited not to be doing this talk alone all morning, and to be joined by Hans Johnson from People for the American Way, with whom I had the pleasure to work in other areas, and also by Loretta Ross, who will be here soon. I've certainly read a lot that Loretta's written and heard a lot about her, so I know she'll be good. I know she'll be good. I wanted to just introduce myself. You have a right to know who I am, where I come from, and all of this. As Edward said, I'm the director of the Office of Lesbian, Bisexual, Gay Concerns at the Unitarian Universalist Association. And if you had told me 2 years ago when I took that job that I would be going on national speaking tours about the religious right, I would have said, I don't think so. It's a surprising time for all of us. What happened for me and what galvanized me very particularly is the kind of phone calls that were coming in on my lines all the time. A heterosexual teacher in Kansas who lost her job as a health professional in the schools for not even saying the number of an AIDS hotline, but telling someone that she would tell them later the number of an AIDS hotline. Unitarian Universalists in Colorado and Oregon and in other areas being attacked by anti-gay ballot initiatives, calling me in pain, and ministers feeling out there on the line. And so I started asking myself, how am I supposed to minister to all of these people? And escalating violence, anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual violence. Since I've been in that office for 2 years, we've had 3 Unitarian Universalist gay men murdered for being gay. And we're a small group, and we're a fairly privileged and buffered group compared to a lot of people. So that number says a lot to me. So somewhere along the line, I started to pay pretty close attention to this group called the religious right. And I want to unpack that term a little bit. There are a lot of terms thrown around: new right, religious right, conservatives, neoconservatives, neoconservatives with capital letters versus small letters, ultra-conservatives, far right, Christian right, fundamentalists. People sometimes use these terms interchangeably, and I want to ask us to be a little more careful than that. We could spend the whole day setting up terminology, and I don't want to do that. But I do want to carefully and clearly differentiate fundamentalism from what we're talking about today. Because I hear people using the term fundamentalist to talk about what I would consider a political agenda. As Edward said, we're talking about a political agenda today, not a religious agenda. I want to share this quote from one of my teachers in this field, Suzanne Farr, and she says this: "Not all Christians belong to the Christian right, nor do all fundamentalists. There are approximately 50 million Christian fundamentalists in the U.S. Of that number, only 15 to 20 million are organized into the political and social agenda of the Christian right. The remainder range from conservative to progressive, and all are simply exercising their basic right to practice the religious and spiritual beliefs of their choice." So, my own bias in calling anybody anything is to see what they call themselves and call them that. That's the liberal way. You give people the chance to decide what they want to be called, and what groups like Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition call themselves is simply Christians. But we have to be really clear that when they say Christian, they mean something very different from what many people mean. In fact, Robertson has said, he was griping because when people want a Christian perspective, they went to the United Methodists. He said, "I have nothing more in common with the United Methodists than I do with a Buddhist." So and my most graphic illustration of this is that I was on an interfaith panel this summer in Colorado Springs to celebrate the 100th anniversary of America the Beautiful, the hymn, or song. And we had an interfaith panel that included the president of the Disciples of Christ, the president of the United Church of Christ, Mormons, Presbyterians, Methodists, you name it. The religious right refused to participate in that event. Not as I had feared, because I was there as an open lesbian. They in fact didn't seem to pay one bit of attention to me or to that. But because at their service, which they had at the same time, they did a chant, which was "Diversity is perversity." And diversity apparently extends even into diverse Christian beliefs. So this is a very, I believe that to call them Christian, as they call themselves, would, for me, remove the power and the impact of what I consider, as somebody who identifies with the liberation Christian theology, would take away Christianity as I know that word, and I won't give it to them. So I'm not going to call them Christians. I like to call them anti-democratic extremists. Because a guy from the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights recently told me that a survey of a number of people, hundreds of thousands of people, said that they saw nothing negative about the term religious right and wouldn't have any problem endorsing a candidate of the religious right. And I think it is, religious and right. I wanted a bumper sticker like the one we had, "The moral majority is neither." I wanted one that said, "The religious right is neither." But even within that definition of being Christian, Pat Robertson does believe that only people who are Christian, and again, I'd say as he means Christian, or Jewish, should be allowed to hold office in this country. And here's a quote from him. "When I said during my presidential bid that I would only bring Christians and Jews into the government, the media challenged me. How dare you maintain that those who believe the Judeo-Christian values are better qualified to govern America than Hindus and Muslims? My simple answer is yes, they are. If anybody really understood what Hindus believe, there would be no doubt that they have no business administering government policies in a country that favors freedom and equality. There will never be world peace until God's house and God's people are given their rightful place of leadership at the top of the world. How can there be peace when drunkards, drug dealers, communists, atheists, New Age worshipers of Satan, secular humanists, oppressive dictators, greedy money changers, revolutionary assassins, adulterers, and homosexuals are on top?" So what we're going to be doing this morning is kind of initially a real broad overview of what we're talking about, and then we'll have a panel which will get real specific on the local issues, which is, I'm sure, what galvanized most of you to be here. But I think it can be helpful to put it into a broader context. I, on the other hand, am always excited to get into talking with people on local levels, because that is in fact where all the action is, and where we basically learn the things which we'll tell people at our next talk. This person in Atlanta told me. So let's talk about what this group is. Call them what you want. And I will call them religious extremists for the moment. It's a big discussion about what to call this group. You got a better name today?
Religious rights movement.
You stick with that one. This is basically a huge network, is what we're looking at. It started actually with Barry Goldwater's campaign. 12,000 signatures were gathered on a computer, which is ironic, because you know Barry Goldwater has now soundly denounced this group. He cannot stand this group of people, but that is where the initial mailing list came from. And people like Paul Weyrich and some other conservatives who weren't necessarily using any religious language started to develop a broad network of support for a conservative agenda. They then learned how powerful it could be to use religious rhetoric to couch this agenda in. And so, as you'll recall, Jerry Falwell started the Moral Majority and then disbanded the Moral Majority. And when Robertson ran for president in 1988, you know, you could say that he was defeated and that was a blow. But what he did do was gather 250,000 signatures addresses, information about people onto a computer base. And that was basically the start of the Christian Coalition. Whereas the Moral Majority had really, presented itself to be the moral majority. The Christian Coalition and most of the groups that I'm talking about today tend to use language that puts them as a righteous minority. They're really into Daniel in the lion's den. They're really into being persecuted, being tiny, unfunded, therefore send us money, minority. And really appealing to people who right now, at this time in our history, are feeling disenfranchised and are feeling like Daniel in the lion's den. And there are a lot of people with pretty good reason to be feeling that way these days. Between the economic situation and, the laundry list that I don't have to give. But there are a lot of things that truly are not working that we're all seeking to address. And so there are a lot of people who feel disenfranchised. I think Ross Perot's candidacy for president really gave us a signal about how many people feel how disenfranchised. And I'm not talking about who Ross Perot was. I'm talking about before anybody knew anything about him, they were willing to vote for him just because he wasn't part of either party. That's how close, in my mind, that's how close we are to fascism. Again, not because I'm saying Ross Perot's a fascist. I'm not saying anything about Ross Perot. I'm saying that when people would vote for somebody they don't know anything about, that is dangerous. So these groups started to come together, and the Christian Coalition was founded in 1989, and after Robertson's presidential campaign, what he decided was rather than focus on a national level, it was much better to get local grassroots organization going on, which is why we learn what we learn from the local level. That's where it's happening. People who look on the national level for something to be going on are going to say, this group isn't very powerful anymore, it's not doing much. They're starting on a grassroots level. And in fact, I think, as Edward pointed to, they're really lifting up the democratic process and the access that people do have to impacting what happens in this country. And they're doing it better than we wish that they were. So they have chapters all over the country now in every state except for Hawaii, last I heard. But it changes all the time. And at this point, they're 4 years old, and the latest membership statistics I heard are 500,000. Their annual budget is $12 million, but that is separate from all of Robertson's TV stations and everything, the Family Channel and all of that, which are for profit and which are bringing in millions and millions and millions of dollars, but they're not part of his ministry. So they came up with some strategy to do leadership training so that these grassroots activists could have access to information about how to make change on a local level. And in fact, most of these things, like Cobb County that we see, seem to follow leadership training sessions. People go, they get empowered on how to make impact, and they do it. Fairfax County, Virginia also just happened following Christian Coalition Leadership School. And they have think tanks, which I wish I could say that the progressives in this country right now, we're all in coalition having think tanks. We're doing, I don't need to minimize what we do, but I think we really can look at what they're doing. The 700 Club has access to 55 million homes. So I'm not saying every one of those homes watches it, but they have access to it. And the other group that I always mention is Focus on the Family, the sponsors of Amendment 2 in Colorado. How many of you know about Focus on the Family? Focus on the Family has an annual budget of, 90. I have a friend in Colorado Springs who sends me all the articles. $90 million. They just built a new facility for 5,000 employees, which they're worried about outgrowing. They're doing all kinds of stuff. Now, what they're doing, they've been around since 1977. If you look at their materials aren't like, you open the front page and it starts telling you who to hate, how to hate, or anything like that. In fact, they're doing a ministry to families, which are really in crisis. And they're doing a ministry which is donations optional, and they have 800 numbers for families who are in pain. And so they're doing things that people need, and people reach out and for help and get help. So I don't mean in any way to minimize that they're doing good things. And they've really moved further and further into organizing. Amendment 2 is one of their babies, and they continue. And in fact, their president, James Dobson, just wrote his monthly report that he'd been to the promised land and felt like they'd been too much on the defensive and it was time to go on the offensive. And, I'm not sure what he meant by that, but we'll see. I'm not going to sit here and go through all of these groups. There's some local ones here, and some of them are chapters, and some of them are independent here. But there are many of them, and for looking up information about them, I would refer you to a book which is on Savior called Challenging the Christian Right, the Activist Handbook. It doesn't list them all. There are many, many of these groups, but it does. What it's good about is giving you information. What's their budget? Where are they? How do you get on the mailing list so that you can learn more for yourself? Now, back to not being a researcher of the right, I want to get back to my own phone calls and conversations, which are how I entered this, and look at that Kansas health teacher's, what was going on for her. One thing she was coming up against was widespread of the religious right, done with anti-democratic extremists, which is the abstinence-only curriculum. And one thing that Focus on the Family has, they have a magazine called Physician, they have a magazine called Teacher, they have a magazine called Citizen, and most of this is information like, how physicians should invest their money now that they're going to be poor and stuff. But then sort of buried in the middle of it is talking about the Alabama Family Alliance introduced legislation requiring the state's public schools to include abstinence. It didn't work. They learned not to say they were the religious right, to go back and call it a health issue. And they get the doctors, they get all the doctors to come forward and testify this is a health issue. And so they have a doctor's lobby. Then there are the parents, most of whom don't read this magazine, who may read the Citizen magazine, which will tell them what to do. But there's also things like Concerned Women for America, which has 650,000 members and does what's called kitchen table activism, which is a lot of sitting around and talking about the issues. What do you think about the schools? Aren't they terrible? Let's go do this. And so they're running up against that abstinence only. But then, that could be a parents group. But what holds that in place often are candidates running for and being elected to the school boards. And so that's what holds that in place. It's not just sort of a little parents group. All of a sudden there's an authority saying those parents are right. And the strategy has really been in a lot of these elections not to identify who you are. Many of these people never show up for any, now usually this wouldn't be true on the school board level, but sometimes, never show up for any forums. Don't put anything out. Sometimes women are run because people will vote for women. Of course, I would never, ever do that. And say, oh, a woman, that's good, and so sometimes women are running for these offices, and some of them are school boards, but some of them are, as somebody said to me last night, garbage commissions. I mean, people are running on every level for every kind of offices, and many of them are being elected. They have about a 40% success rate. And then the other issue that is coming up is just the simple authority issue. Who has the authority to tell teenagers about health concerns? And obviously, for some people, not health teachers. The other phone calls that I mentioned, and this is what I mostly work on, is the anti-gay ballot initiatives, which have been up now in 2 states, one in Colorado, lost in Oregon, much more extreme language. Just this week came up in 2 cities, Lewiston, Maine, and Cincinnati, Ohio, and the Colorado-style amendments passed 2-1 in both of those cities. Lewiston is a fairly progressive city. And now we're looking at 8, 9 ballot initiatives coming up on statewide levels this coming year. Now the Colorado one is in the courts, many of you know, and Judge Bayless in the injunctions has said that it's not a constitutional amendment. We all have hope about that, but we can't pin our hopes to the courts on this. In Colorado, even though it's not in effect, it's never been in effect since it was passed, the violence, the anti-gay violence, is up about 500% in Colorado. And so when initiatives like this start coming up, it really gives permission, even though it's not in it to be violent. It starts giving an implicit permission for violence. What homophobia is, and I say this particularly to those of you here today who are lesbian, bisexual, gay, who have internalized homophobia as I do, we start going, why do they hate us? And I think what's really important to know, and I say this to everyone, is it's not about homophobia. What we are is a wedge issue. I want to read a quote from Kevin Tobito, the director of Colorado for Family Values. He said, I submit to you today, to every one of you, this issue with Amendment 2 is not about homosexuality. It's really not even about sex. It's about authority. And I really agree with him. Then he goes on. It's about whose authority takes precedence in the society in which we live. Is it the authority of man or the authority of God? Now, the authority of man would dictate that homosexuality is perfectly okay, that there's nothing wrong with it. The authority of God would say, no, there's plenty wrong with homosexuality. And so I say to you today that Amendment 2 is about authority. It's about whose authority gets to make the decision. And I do believe that the issue with lesbian, gay, bisexual attacks is authority and undermining, turning the talk to who deserves civil rights. And I don't in any way mean to imply that these are the first discussions on deserving civil rights that have ever been held in this country. As any of you know, conversations like this have taken place through every civil rights gains that have ever been made for any people. Do they deserve them? Are they really human? I mean, just long discussions. So I don't in any way mean to say that we're the first. But right now, there's widespread societal confusion and disagreement around issues of homophobia and acceptance of lesbian, bisexual, gay people, and especially in churches. There's a lot of churches are really being pulled apart by this issue, a lot of mainline churches. And so I think of homophobia as like a stun gun, like on those TV shows where everything freezes. I can't remember what show it was, but they could freeze everybody and then it was Get Smart, and then they could go on and do what they wanted to do, That's kind of what homophobia does, and we'll be hearing later how that worked in Cobb County, but that's working all over. That if you attack somebody because they're lesbian, bisexual, gay, a lot of people around will kind of freeze and try to figure it out. And in that frozen moment is when you instigate that you have authority. The new issue that they're really seeing as the wedge issue now actually is taxes. And Robertson just sent out a questionnaire to 2 million so-called Christians. And what he said is, let's tell President Clinton what Christians think. But what he's really doing is gathering a great deal of information for his database. Which candidate would you be most likely to support for president? which of these issues would you absolutely not vote for a candidate if they did this, that, or the other? And so he's gathering a tremendous amount of information. Once we start switching the language, and I'd say right now we really have, we've taken the language of, the right has really been setting the field for our talk about civil rights, and I think we really need to shift that and get it out of the language of deserved rights and worth. And this afternoon in the workshop that I lead, we'll be looking at the film, Gay Rights, Special Rights, which really lifts up and differentiates, people who are racial minorities deserve to have civil rights. They deserve this. People who are lesbian, bisexual, gay are immoral and also rich and privileged and don't deserve it. And so it starts that conversation. It's a very dangerous conversation for all of us. The strategy, one of the scariest strategies to me, and I'd say the thing that I personally am most committed to and working hardest on, is exactly that. It's separating out specifically African Americans and lesbian, bisexuals, and gays right now. There is a real, in Cincinnati, in Colorado, in all of these places, the people who are out speaking against these amendments are primarily African American. Now, the people who are financing these, the people who are doing these, are not the African American community. They have a lot of other things to be doing, but they're, in my opinion, being set up. And so the African Americans that I know are very concerned about this, particularly people who are lesbian, bisexual, and gay, and African American. They said, people are inside of me, pulling me apart. And I want to just issue the challenge to my community, specifically the white community, that if we don't deal with our racism, we're going to lose this thing. In my opinion, racism is the absolute center. It's where the religious right came from. It's where they're going. And if we continue to say, oh my God, we as white gay people are being treated so badly, you should support us, without understanding how we fit in a context, we're not going to win this one. And I really want to win it. I started with Robertson's quote about blowing us out of our bunkers, and my thing in all of this work has been that as I do it, I continue to meet people who are in the bunkers, even against that, don't ask, don't tell thing, but the more of us there are together, the less vulnerable we are, and we are each other's strength, as well as, for me, this certainly makes me call on every spiritual resource that I have. We are each other's strength, and so I'm real excited that we're here. We'll be spending this afternoon really in some smaller groups, talking together, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
My name is Hans Johnson. I'm here from People for the American Way. And given that Loretta is not everyone stand up and stretch. We have a request for stretch time. Is there a second? Now y'all don't go anywhere now. That felt so good. I'm glad you recommended that. Again, my name is Hans Johnson. I'm here from People for the American Way. And I want to talk a little bit more about the religious right and also about some of the tactics that they use against progressive coalitions because they find them effective. Maggie talked a lot about how the religious right has become organized over the last 30 years and also some of their baggage. But I want to highlight right now that the religious right was primarily organized in its early days against the civil rights of African Americans, against the civil rights of people of color in general, against the civil rights of women, against the civil rights of people with disabilities in the last 5 years. And this is where their roots are. These appeals to special rights that we see now were appeals that have been regularly used against people of color, against women, against people with disabilities, and are now being used against the lesbian and gay community as a tactical wedge issue. So when you hear this term about special rights, I'm going to hand around some responses to that argument in just a moment. But I really want to get at that baggage there, because this group, which is now attempting to represent itself as the ally of groups it considers legitimate minorities, has been in the past opposing the Civil Rights Restoration Acts in 1983, 1988, 1991. Some people like Gary Bauer, who was a very, very magnetic leader of the religious right, was very active in the John Birch Society, opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this is where their roots go. But something happened in 1991 when the religious right, after working strenuously to defeat the Civil Rights Restoration Act, which granted remedies for acts of discrimination in the workplace, realized they could not win with their all-out racist appeal the same way that they used to. They had to pick a new enemy. They had to find a new target. They had to find someone else against whom to use this wedge issue and this claim of special rights. So the right has a lot of baggage on this issue, and if allowed to win, will deny civil rights for all people, because once someone's right to be free from discrimination is recognized as somehow a special right, and anyone's right to be free from discrimination is just as special and can be taken away by that same strategy. So I want to highlight that right now. And I want to get in the rest of my talk, I want to talk about how the religious right and why the religious right is using an anti-gay appeal and starting anti-gay campaigns, and also some tactics, some basic tactics that we as progressive people can use to fight them and to fight for our freedom. Because that's ultimately what this struggle is about. Reaching out to people and developing a sophisticated and broad-based movement in support of freedom. Welcome. I see our third speaker has come. Loretta Ross is on her way in. Welcome, Loretta. I'm going to talk a little bit about homophobia right now, and I want to talk about how the religious right is using anti-gay campaigns. One of their chief weapons in this campaign, and it has primarily 3 prongs, is to enact sweeping defamation against lesbians and gay men, attaching to most virulent stereotypes and using arguments about health, using arguments about children, using distorted arguments about money and class status to foment distrust and hatred against lesbians and gay men. Another key element to the right-wing's strategy on this is to continue censoring positive or even neutral images, all but the most hateful images of the lesbian and gay community from public debate. That includes in the public schools, that includes in public libraries, that includes through the arts, that includes through popular films, popular literature, and popular culture. This effort to get out any but the most negative and demeaning and insulting representations of lesbians and gay men goes to even some instances as in Cleveland, Tennessee, where a book called Heather Has Two Mommies, which they have regularly attacked in places like New York and other public libraries, even here in Gainesville recently, was checked out by one of the primary religious right groups which we see taking action across the country, and that's Concerned Women for America. They checked this book out regularly until the past due notice came, and then they actually admitted to having stolen the book. And this is again, I want to emphasize, this is a tactic that's taking place across the country. stealing books from public libraries, checking them out regularly, organizing concerted checkouts by people in their organization so that these resources are never available to the people who most need them. People who are starved for honest representations or even fair representations of themselves, and for people who are concerned about who the lesbian community is. People who most need this, particularly teens, people who are starved for images of themselves and for who the community is. Another element of this, which Meg also alluded to, is the effort to cut off lesbians and gay men from other minority groups in this country by supposedly aligning themselves with the supposedly more legitimate minority groups in this country, African Americans, Latinos, in some cases aligning themselves with women, although that is still a tenuous alliance, since it was Pat Robertson himself who called the Equal Rights Amendment an attempt by lesbians to kill their children, leave their husbands, and undermine the capitalist system. And practice witchcraft, of course. We all know the Equal Rights Amendment said that. But because they realized that their base appeals to racism and to misogyny and to removing the right to an abortion from women were not ultimately successful methods, they had to seize on a new method. And by doing that, by trying to ally themselves with other minority groups, whom they seem to have lately come upon as the best allies of these groups, but for whom they really have a long baggage of opposing, this is yielding some results for them, unfortunately. And that's something that we need to know about, something we need to take seriously, and something that forms a key element of their anti-gay campaign. No, excuse me. If someone could get some water, I would really appreciate that. I think all three of us would like some water. I don't mean to make anyone feel guilty, but thank you so much. There are some basic tactics that I think progressives need to understand in terms of organizing in our communities. These are some tactics that the religious right has mastered quite successfully, but if we get them down, we'll make for a progressive coalition that will not be able to be divided by these sorts of appeals. I call it the 4 M's and the 4 F's. The 4 M's help get you the 4 F's. The first of the M's is money. If you have money, you can do any number of things, from buying media to getting your message out to helping identify new members, which are also some of the other M's. But money, as in Cincinnati, which we just saw this week, won the campaign for the religious right in their anti-gay crusade there. $75,000 came into Cincinnati from Colorado Family Values for the anti-gay campaign. That alone was more than the progressives were able to raise in support of the human rights ordinance there. When you have that sort of money at your disposal, you can do the sorts of things that the anti-gay crusaders did in Cincinnati, buying full-page ads every day the week before the election, putting on 4 times the number of television commercials as your opponents on television the 2 weeks before the election, putting on radio ads that make even progressive people feel isolated in their homes continually when you're hearing this message bombarding you over and over again that special rights is wrong, vote yes on issue 3. That is the sort of access, thank you so much, thank you so much, that money can buy. So money is a key element here. But if you do not have money, the rest of these 3 M's are crucial. Those are media. You need to have access to the media. You need to have a media which is representing you fairly, which is giving your constituency some sort of coverage, and you need to know how to manage the media, whether that means you're getting on radio, whether that means television, whether that means cable access, whether your audience that you want to reach watches any of these particular things or subscribes to these particular organs. You need to know media, and media can help you win campaigns. A third M is message. You need a message that is clear, that encapsulates the views of your constituency, that conveys the power and the depth of concern that you hold about a particular issue. You need a message that brings in the breadth of people, the number of voices that you have in your constituency, your coalition. So you need a message that you can deliver over and over again that gets through to people, especially the people that you want to reach. And if you're trying to reach people of faith who are opposed to the religious right, or people who oppose the use of bigotry by the religious right to justify their politics, then you'll have to consider putting clergy people at the focus of your message and making a faith-based appeal to people to stand up for democratic values. But your message, no matter what, is key. And a fourth thing is masses. You need masses of people to be organized around your other concerns, and your message will be something that you want to craft so that you can attract the broadest masses of people. That means that you try to gather a coalition that is constantly broadening itself into other aspects of the community, that you have a number of people who are registered to vote that can actually impact an election, in which you have candidates of concern, particularly when there's a stark alignment between your candidates, when you have one candidate who supports and respects the rights of women to choose on abortion, someone who respects civil rights, someone who is in favor of multicultural curriculum, someone who supports the separation of church and state, and someone who opposes it and goes down the line from there. You need masses of people, and I think that's probably the fourth and perhaps most crucial of the M's. All of these M's, as I mentioned, help get you 4 F's. And maybe the first of those F's might be, I was thinking about this in terms of lesbian and gay people. If you're speaking out and you've done your message, well, the first of the F's you might get is fired. But we don't want to talk about that. So whenever you're speaking out, you always run the risk of some of those, of that happening. But I think right now, the more crucial one of those F's that a lot of us are experiencing from this is fear. And the real 4 F's that we're trying to get at are, in some ways, an effort to combat that fear. The first of the F's is to frame the issues. When you frame the issues in terms of civil rights against inequality, or non-discrimination against unfairness, or intrusions on your privacy, or the denial of respect and dignity, I think that's one of the most crucial acts that you can get, because from all of the framing that you do of the issues, people begin to see you in a different light. And unfortunately, right now, some of our opponents on religious right are trying to claim a broad sector of the political spectrum. And they're trying to isolate those of us who support dignity, free expression, and civil rights, and multicultural curriculum, for instance, as being the extremists. And the more people they can get on board in saying that, the more they're able to convince people, the more they're able to frame the issues, to frame the issues in ways that are supportive of their side. However, when we are able to frame issues and to identify them as being coming from an extreme viewpoint, trying to take away freedom, trying to divide communities against themselves, that helps us in our effort to reach out to people, to register people, to get people active in the political process, and to eventually win those sorts of initiatives that we need for our freedom. But framing the issues is the first of the F's. I think the second F is we help get favorable policies. When we put your money, your media, your message, and your masses together, it certainly helps you to obtain favorable policies from people in office, from your local school board, from people even in your workplace, for instance, if you're organizing there to get domestic partnership benefits or any sort of other remedies which respond to your drive for equality there. But you get favorable policies from the people who are supposed to be representing you. That's one of the essences of the democratic process, is that when you are organized and when you are beginning to foment a coalition which represents the basic needs of people, that you will try to get those favorable policies implemented through the people who are supposed to be representing you. Probably the third act, and I don't want to say this absolutely, because people who are our friends in office aren't always our friends. But we can certainly help elect and have friends and not foes in office. And I think that the extent to which we have friends representing us, friends in office, is directly related to how big our masses were in our ends. When we have a mass that's broad and it encompasses the full sector of the community and desires of all people to be represented, whether that be based on a coalition that crosses lines of religion or race or sexual orientation, certainly ones that cross the lines of gender. Those friends will be accountable for us. And when we have friends in office who respect the rights of poor people, especially, and when poor people are a part of our coalitions, I don't think we're going to see the sorts of divisions made by our friends that make them less our friends. That when they, for instance, do not respect the rights of poor women to make decisions on abortion as much as they may help respect the rights of wealthier women who may have more access to health care in the first place, that those sorts of divisions don't matter as much when our coalition is broad from the start and encompasses those people who need those rights just as much as everyone else does. So when we have friends in office and we have a mass that encompasses a broad range of people, those friends will be our friends on a much wider array of issues, and we will not have to go about labeling them our foes and getting better friends in office. But certainly, working with the money, media, message, and masses helps get our friends and not foes to represent us. I think the final act, and probably the most important one, and it may mean something different to each one of us, that we help get out of working together with our money, our media, our message, and our masses of people in our coalition, is our freedom. And it was that sort of freedom that I think Maya Angelou was talking about when she stood up in front of Washington, D.C. at the inauguration just 11 months ago, talking about how freedom means something very different to each one of us. Freedom may mean the right to fairness in our workplace, and it might mean the struggle to have representation in a labor union or to work with management in constructing the guidelines by which we work. Freedom might mean to be safe in your communities, whether that be from gun violence or from harassment or from police abuse. Freedom might mean to have civil rights recognized and respected from every level of government. It might mean to finally be able to participate on an equal footing in the political process. But freedom is the last of the F's, and that is one of the direct results of putting together the four M's. Now, in working together to establish this coalition, because I think it's coalitions that are probably one of the most powerful and best experiences that people can ever have in their lives, certainly in their political lives, having a coalition that works takes hard work, and it's not easy to go out and organize, especially when it's probably more comfortable to sit home sometimes and say, oh, I don't want to work with her, I don't want to work with him, we work together all the time, and we just spit and fight each other all the time. Well, when you can establish some way of working with people in a coalition, even those you dislike, people you may happen to distrust, people of whom you're ignorant, people whose experiences you do not yet know, and certainly people whose history you may not be aware of. That sort of coalition is where power comes from. And I want to talk about some of the allies that we have at our disposal who we may or may not yet have reached. Some of those allies are people in the fields of education, as Nick was talking about. Public education is one of the primary areas that the religious right focuses on in trying to paralyze teachers from talking about certain issues, in trying to stick candidates on school boards who do not represent the desires of the community and who adhere to a narrow political agenda, that public educators and teachers' unions and teachers' groups, education groups, are very experienced in handling religious right and are people that we need to be talking to. Oftentimes, they're also very experienced in framing messages that we were talking about as well, that how important your message is, messages that bring in a broad range of the political spectrum. Moderate people can get on board when you're putting out a message that they feel like encompasses their concerns, and education groups are some of the key resources and allies we might seek out in doing that. Another group are clergy people. And clergy people, when speaking out against the religious right, against the use of bigotry to promote a particularly narrow brand of politics, clergy people are very, very effective. And there are even many clergy people whose instincts politically may be quite conservative, but when enlisted in the fight against discrimination or in support of fairness, understand these issues quite well and can be brought in with your message that allows them to be part of your coalition, and a very important part for a progressive coalition. And a third part of people, a third group of people are people in business, and those are people who stand to lose when their market or their state, their city, their county, like in Cobb, becomes labeled with intolerance or with bigotry or with denying the civil rights of a particular group of people. Business people and those people who work in businesses, labor people who stand to lose as well if those markets dry up, if people stop coming to a place because it becomes attached to intolerance. Those are people we need to be reaching out to for establishing a coalition that responds to the concerns and ultimately reflects the desires of all of us for freedom. And when we begin reaching out to this broader range of people, talking honestly about the issues, and I want to hand out right now that response sheet that I was mentioning about special rights. That we begin to be less susceptible to the sorts of divisions that were evidenced in the Cobb County battle. One of the crucial things that I want to convey today is that the religious rights use of an anti-gay appeal is motivated in some ways beyond their desire to take away civil rights for gay people, and ultimately, as I was saying before, to put everyone's civil rights in danger. It's motivated by a desire to build lists and to gain allies, to enlist the masses, as I was talking about before, in future campaigns, in future efforts. When you bring people out with an anti-gay appeal, it's amazing, but that you can come back to those people again and again and again when you want to pass something else, when you want to get some other candidate elected, when you want to get a commissioner elected to Cobb County Commission. So when they do those sorts of things, they use those lists over and over again. And as I was mentioning myself, we need to become proficient in developing our own masses, but we need to become also more unified and less distrustful and less fragmentary when those sorts of wedge issues are appealed to. So also, this is about unifying a progressive coalition. And I want to make that clear that this use by the religious right is partly on its face what they're going after, to deprive people of civil rights. But it's also to develop lists and to develop followers that they can recruit a number of other issues down the road. Right now, I want to hand around just a listing of that you can sign up for. This is a People for the American Way's activist list, in which you'll be regularly updated about some of these issues I was talking about, and you can also get materials on a regular basis that will help you respond to these sorts of charges. So I want to hand that.
I'm going to do my handout that I forgot. Always do.
And even if you are a member, this is an activist list. So this is for people who are interested in being active in your communities and responding to religious rights. Sometimes our members don't get all the regular follow-up that our activists do. So I would wish, even if you are a member, please sign up. Again, I want to emphasize these messages one more time, and that is that if we are going to establish a broad coalition of people, we need to understand that there are new and untapped alliances that we still have left unmade, or which we have not even attempted to make, and which, if made, can make the sort of coalitions that really become undefeatable when people promote bigotry to try to drive them apart. So I would encourage you in the rest of the day to be thinking about new people that you can talk to, places that you can raise this message about basic fairness and civil rights, and also when we're talking about money, media, message, and masses, that there are places to go in our communities to help accrue those. And when we accrue those, as I said, we can go about gaining a framing of the issues that's more akin to what we're looking for. We can obtain favorable policies from people who are supposed to represent us. We can get our friends in office instead of our foes, and we can ultimately obtain our freedom. Thank you very much. The next speaker, as I took, is Loretta Ross from the Center for Democratic Renewal. Loretta has been a tireless advocate for the rights of poor people, for the rights of people to be free from racist discrimination, harassment, and intimidation, and is a tireless accruer and archive of information about the far right and how those movements are akin to the ones we're talking about with religious right.
Thank you, Hans. Actually, I'm more tired than tireless. I've been on a whirlwind travel schedule. I just recently got back from South Africa, looking at how the far right in that country is trying to threaten the democratic process there. And one of the things we have to understand in all of this is that what we're experiencing here in Georgia, here in Cobb County, is not an isolated event. It is part of a worldwide movement to defeat democracy. And until we understand that, we really don't understand what is at stake, because we tend to take these people lightly. We think that they're a trend or fad that will fade. But in fact, it is part of what we call at the Center for Democratic Renewal. Lord. Center for Democratic Removal. That's almost what I said. Center for Democratic Renewal is part of a worldwide upswing in people's flirting or open embracing of fascism. And unless we call it that and name it that, we don't understand the connection between what's going on in a unified Germany, what's going on in South Africa, with what's going on here in the United States. We seem to think that that's just their problem, or that's just something happening over there. I think I'll start a little bit by giving you a little history on CDR, because a lot of you probably haven't heard of us. Our name doesn't tell you what we do. The Center for Democratic Renewal, we get a lot of calls at the office asking if we're a wing of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, we don't get their contributions. We just get the calls. We are not a wing of the Democratic Party. We chose that name in 1985 when we changed our name from the National Anti-Klan Network. We were founded in 1979 to monitor hate groups, to monitor the Ku Klux Klan and various neo-Nazi groups. And we were founded by a multiracial, interdenominational, gay, straight, we have every mix that you can possibly have within our board and within our founding set. The only people we probably didn't factor in was people under 21, and we hear from them a lot about that omission. But when we were founded as the National Anti-Klan Network, we existed very happily with that name. And then finally, about 5 or 6 years into our growth, someone asked us a very pointed question. They said, well, if you're the National Anti-Klan Network, it's pretty clear what you're against. But what are you for? And we thought about it, and because we have a whole lot of ministers on our board, we talked about it a long, long time. And finally, we figured out that what we are for is for the practice of democracy in America without racism and bigotry. And hence our name, the Center for Democratic Renewal. Now we've got an even catchier tagline. We call ourselves the pro-democracy movement of America. But basically, we say that because many people don't understand that this democratic system that we have is still an evolutionary one. It was not perfect when it was founded, and Lord knows it's not perfect today. That there was considerable disenfranchisement of people when those men wrote the Constitution, but they did set something in place that could be amended, that could be worked upon, that could give us a process for including increasingly larger numbers of people in this democratic experience. Unfortunately, we do have a set of people who are convinced that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson et al. Were the greatest defenders of liberty and justice in the world. I don't think my ancestors quite see them that way. But it is important that they put in place things that would allow me to say that about them now. Historically at CDR, we've been monitoring the Ku Klux Klan, and I say Klan as verbal shorthand. There are over 300 neo-Nazi Ku Klux Klan groups here in the United States, and so I could bore you or make your stomach turn by naming them all. But we saw ourselves as looking at those that wore sheets in verbal shorthand, or swastikas, or brown shirts, or what have you. And that was very good. And we left to groups like People for the American Way and other groups to monitor other aspects of the right wing. We took the ones that were really outside the margins in terms of the political discourse. At least that's where they were back then. What we found, though, over the last decade is that there's been an absolute and total blurring of the lines. We used to, just a very short while ago, as recently as 5 years ago, we could say, well, there's the far right, there's the Klan, and there's the neo-Nazi groups. Then there's the religious right, or the Christian right, the groups that are somewhere in the middle, having very extremist views, but the one couldn't confuse them with the far right. And then there was the conservative right, the new right. And so those groups like ours that work on these issues, we kind of like divided up the turf real neatly, and we'll do the ones that wear sheets, you'll do the ones that don't wear sheets, and you'll do the ones that wear crosses. And have that kind of working arrangement. But over the last 5 years, all of those lines have blurred. For example, we all know our favorite perennial gubernatorial candidate, David Duke, who ran for governor in the state of Louisiana. Well, he almost got elected. He got 55% of the white vote. And if it hadn't been for the fact that a record number of black folks turned out in the state of Louisiana, he would have been that state's governor. So let's not talk about David Duke. Let's talk about a man who was a key supporter of David Duke. Right now, the state coordinator of Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition in Louisiana is the Reverend Billy McCormick, who was a David Duke supporter in the gubernatorial race. So again, that's just one example. I have dozens of how the lines are blurred. Right now, I'm engaged in a new research project that involves creating a massive database of the anti-abortion movement. We're getting arrest records, newspaper accounts, police reports, et cetera, around the people who are consistently trying to blockade clinics, who commit violence against clinics, of course those who bomb the clinics and assault or murder clinic staff and personnel. And we're putting this database together of their names. Just a couple of weeks ago, I cross-referenced those names with our Klan and Nazi names. And it's amazing, the overlap, so that you have people like a Ralph Forbes down in Arkansas, who at one time was with the National States' Rights Party and the Ku Klux Klan, who now is one of the leaders of the assault against women's clinics in Arkansas, and can now be found at many Christian right meetings. And so I think my overall message, going back to one of the formulas that Hans used, is that right now we can't tell who wears sheets versus who doesn't. That they may wear them at night and take them off and get a nose job and put on a nice suit in the day, like David Duke did. And because of this, it is very hard in many ways to convince what we call the middle of America, the majority of the people, to take these people very seriously. Because our enemy is a moving target that isn't just fixed in one place, but in fact not only leaps from one extreme of the right to the other, but leaps from issue to issue, depending on which is more popular, which is more successful for them at a given time. Certainly, they latched onto and played abortion or opposition to abortion for all that it was worth. And I certainly believe that their current campaign against gays and lesbians has a strong kernel of homophobia. I would not deny its homophobic content, but I also think it's just their latest weapon in a long-term struggle to undermine the entirety of what we call civil rights. We can also find these people in the environmental movement. Of course, we find them in the movements to oppose gun control, in the educational movements, et cetera, et cetera. So they have a whole array of weapons that they will use. One of the things that doesn't often come clear, at least to me, when people try to fight the religious right, is seeing the underlying racism that is inherent in everything they do and say, because they don't use the familiar racial code words that we are very used to hearing. Certainly in the 80s, the new right or the conservative right pulled off several language coups when they started defining remedies for racism as reverse racism against white people, for example. And so these language coups, though, continue in this special rights, no discrimination language that they're using as part of their homophobic attacks. But when I talk about the underlying racism of their campaigns, one other thing I'm looking at, and we'll be having for the state of Georgia by January, a report on the religious right here in Georgia and its connections to the far right. I'm in the process of writing that for our next newsletter. Stop, commercial time. I wasn't smart enough to bring my literature in here, so I left it outside. On the literature tables is a publication list of all of CDR's publications that you can order. There are also free copies of our newsletter called The Monitor. Available for sale are 2 books that I hope you consider buying. One of them is called The Christian Identity Movement. A lot of people don't understand the theological, I don't know if it's right to call them that, the religious beliefs of hate groups and a lot of these groups and how they operate. How do they interpret the Bible? How do they use the Bible to justify their hatred and their intolerance? And we wrote this book a couple of years ago because a young man came to this pastor and asked for an explanation of some things he was hearing within the racist movement, and the pastor was unable to provide this explanation to him, to convince him that black people were not people who were created before Adam. And, Adam, of course, being the original man or original white person in the world. The Jews were not the product of Satan and Eve having a good time. And these are the actual beliefs of the Christian identity movement. Well, to make a long story short, because the pastor did not recognize the types of questions that he was getting from this young man, he kind of brushed the guy off. About a year later, that young man was found dead at the encampment of the Aryan Nations in Idaho because he took his questioning of these racist beliefs to the wrong place. And so this pastor got in contact with us and asked us to write something available for religious leaders that explains their theological beliefs so that if these questions come up again, someone would know, you'd have a source to go to answer them. The second book we have out there is our latest and most exciting project. It's a training manual called When Hate Groups Come to Town, a handbook of effective community responses. Now, here at CDR, we've worked with over 500 groups, 500 cities that have had to deal with hate groups when they come to town. Now, the title is a bit misleading. Oh, thank you. Yeah. She's smarter than I am. I didn't even bring one of those in so I could do something. But anyway, in working with all of these towns, as I said, the title is a little misleading because we say when hate groups come to town, this is what you need to do. But the reality is that most hate groups already live in the town. They're not coming from anywhere except across the street sometimes. But still, the initial perception of many people is that someone came here and launched this hatred. We can't have all of this already existing in our community. It's a training manual for anyone, the media, religious leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, teachers. We have chapters written for young people. We have a chapter written by anti-racist skinheads that speak to skinheads. It's really a how to fight hate groups training manual, and it is available outside. And so enough of the commercial. Going back to the whole question of the blurred lines and the religious right, the far right and conservative right. One of the things that has happened that I think has shifted the terrain of what we're dealing with is that particularly since Reagan's presidency ended, because that's I think is significant. These people, for the most part, disliked and distrusted George Bush, but Reagan was their man, and I think that was why there was such a strong Pat Buchanan campaign within the Republican Party, and why Pat Buchanan got pretty much front and center stage at the 92 Republican convention. So I think that was one thing that caused the terrain to shift. I also think that they made a strategic shift in moving away from focusing on national offices and national politics and moving to state and local races where they felt that a smaller set of people could have a much greater impact. But in many ways, the local people were not prepared for this. Just like they're not prepared, you're not prepared when you read in your newspaper that the Ku Klux Klan has decided to apply for a march permit, or it wants to join your Christmas parade with a float saying, "I'm dreaming of a white Christmas." Many times. That is a true story. That happens in Gainesville, Georgia, every Christmas. That the Klan applies for a permit to march, to be in the Christmas parade with the float entitled, "I'm dreaming of a white Christmas." And for the last 2 years, they've had to cancel the Christmas parade as a strategy for keeping the Klan out of the parade. This year, fortunately, they've had the foresight to write some new parade ordinances that take care of it. But that's what happens when, we have a saying in the civil rights community, at least the black wing, sometimes it takes white folks a little bit longer to get it. Anyway. Moving right along. The previous speakers talked about the stealth candidates and all that, so I won't revisit that area. But I want to give you an example of one of the things that happens that exposes the racism of their strategies. When they transformed school boards in San Diego County by putting a lot of stealth candidates, getting a lot of stealth candidates elected, one of the very first programs that they sought to attack was the free breakfast program. And they attacked the free breakfast program saying that, first of all, feeding children was the responsibility of parents, not schools. Though I'm not convinced that a hungry child can really concentrate on learning. But their real rationale was that the free breakfast program fed primarily Latino and Black children, and they couldn't tolerate that. Once we pointed out this type of strategy to the Black community in San Diego, they began to get really pissed off. So, and they saw themselves being attacked, but unfortunately it was after the fact because they didn't understand the dangers of the stealth candidates. They didn't understand that they possibly could have mobilized before they got elected and kept them out of office. But still, you do what you can do. They're also very sophisticated at exploiting the weaknesses of our side, our progressive movement. I think that it's no big secret. We who call ourselves progressive have a whole lot of baggage within our movement. I know we spend endless PC discussions trying to get rid of some of this baggage. Some of the biggest baggage, I think, and this is simply a subjective opinion, is the racism within our movement. That is, thank you. That is, and one thing about people who are in the civil rights movement, again, I have to go back to Black people in the civil rights movement, racism is like a bad odor. You can smell it from across the room. You don't even have to be close to it, kind of thing. And that is something that has fractured much of our coalitional work for years, for absolute years. And because we don't take it up seriously, this creates the space for someone coming from this combined right-wing force to come in and play on the racism and then pull away from our side people who are tired of our racism. The same thing happens around gay and lesbian rights. I think that our side, as much as we like to maybe behind it, is intensely homophobic. I think that that's why we're having so many debates within our very own, quote, progressive churches about whether or not the gay and lesbian lifestyle is an appropriate and normal lifestyle. It is our own homophobia. This is not coming from without. This is right here with us. And that's one of the things that makes us vulnerable, I think, and they are very cleverly exploiting that. I think that most of the mainstream Protestant churches are seeing a tremendous loss of membership to fundamentalist and religious right institutions. And I think that that's part of the reason, because we have not inoculated ourselves, in a sense, against these types of things. And of course, it goes without saying that we carry with us the baggage of sexism. I also hear quite a bit, almost unspoken, but it's there sometimes. When you work on race, like I do, you can smell it from across the room. And I hear a lot of unspoken anti-Semitism within the progressive cause. And so these are also ways that they exploit our weaknesses. Now, I do want to say that they have weaknesses of their own. And it's our job to understand those weaknesses, point those weaknesses out, and seek to do a little wedge building, driving ourselves to dividing some very uneasy allies. I find it just absolutely amazing that this congruence of forces contains, for example, Catholics and Protestants, when only very recently did groups like the Ku Klux Klans and the neo-Nazis just ceased their anti-Catholic campaigns. I just find that absolutely amazing. Talk about uneasy allies. One of the purposes of my anti-abortion project is to show that in this movement that calls us opposed to abortion is the same people that the Catholic Church calls itself opposing in its racial justice work. So it's going to have to make a decision, and I want to call the question. People of color against women, because I happen to have been born simultaneously both. and I think it's very important that we look for those crevices, that we can drive those wedges in. So that if they want to hang out with the guys that wear sheets at night, at least they're going to have to own it. They're not going to be able to deny it. And that's very important. They also have a lot of tension in the movement on really interesting things. One of the most unmentioned tensions within the religious right, in my mind, is the role of women. Because they have all of these mealy-mouthed sayings about a woman's place in the home and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and blah, 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 beaver cleaver and all that stuff. Yet they have some decidedly aggressive leadership women. Now, how do you recognize the leadership of this women, which a person like me would call quite feminist, with the message that they're not supposed to be leaders, they're supposed to be breeders? I don't get it, but I do understand that as much as I can push that button, I'm going to push it. And I know it pains all my feminist friends to describe a Beverly LaHaye as feminist, but I certainly do describe her as a leader and talk about her qualities in that regard, because I think it embarrasses them to have to acknowledge women's leadership, to keep their wheels spinning. And as far as I can tell, they're not staying home having no babies. The ones that I see. There's other issues that create a lot of tension. The whole issue around violence in our society, particularly focusing on issues like gun control. There is a long spectrum of positions within that religious conservative right. Of course, the extreme right, they're the ones who are most virulently anti-gun control, because they want to hold on to their weapons for what they consider is the inevitable race war that's going to take place. But then within that spectrum, there are many people who have this seamless garment of nonviolence, and that's why they oppose abortion, that's why they oppose the death penalty, and that's why they support gun control. And we've driven a wedge in that for us. We may not be able to get them on abortion, we may not be able to get them on something else, but we can certainly raise the issue within them. And so I could go on, and I know we're running out of time, and I think we want some time for questions. But the last thing I want to focus on, because that's enough talking about them, but I do want to close with talking about us. One of the things that I think our movement truly and sorely lacks is a focus on building on our common agenda. We're too much driven by single issues. We're too much driven by, this is what we need to all respond to in a crisis mode today, and then we go home and bake some cookies or, plant some flowers or watch some football games until it's time for the next crisis. What we don't do is spend the time in between crises building upon our solidarity, building upon our common ground. One of the things that CDR is going to sponsor next fall is a national conference called Our Common Agenda. We want to pull together the representatives of civil rights organizations, gay and lesbian organizations, environmental organizations, women's rights organizations, civil liberties organizations, progressive religious leaders, et cetera, to talk about what our common ground is. Because one thing that is very clear, as the convergence of the right has taken place, they have cut up and divided the turf. But we have not come together to converge and do the same thing. And I'm going to tell you, you are not going to fight somebody coming at you with a closed fist with your fingers spread like this very effectively. And so we have to almost become that closed fist. I hate to use such a violent imagery, but sometimes they really piss me off. And so I want some more closed fists that describe our common ground. And so listen out for more announcements of this. We're going to be having some planning meetings on this concept in the early spring. We're going to kick off some events with Martin Luther King's birthday this January, because the entire civil rights movement, at least that portion of which I'm privileged to be in, the black side, is talking about we've got to build common ground. We're not going to get it. We can't even get a decent discussion on what racism in this country. For a brief minute after they beat Rodney King and LA exploded, this country discussed racism. And then it nodded and went back to sleep again. And that is the usual picture. And so we can't get our issues on the center stage unless we build it on that common ground. Thank y'all. See you.
I'm really bad at double negatives. I get it the lines.
What happened was that on January 7th of this year, the Lewiston City Council passed a human rights ordinance which said that people shall not be discriminated against in public accommodations, housing, or employment on the basis of sexual orientation. In the 2 weeks following that vote, it was approved by a vote of 5-2 in City Council, with the mayor strongly supported, and there were heckling and death threats against both the police chief, the mayor, and members of the City Council who voted for that ordinance in the week preceding it and in the week that followed it. In the 2 weeks immediately after it, opponents of the ordinance gathered over 8,000 signatures on a petition to stop it from being enforced. And that mandated a referendum in the city. This is a tactic that the religious right is using in every city where an anti-gay or an anti-discrimination ordinance is passed that in some way includes sexual orientation or includes lesbians and gay men and those prohibitions against discrimination. And this is a very common tactic. And that gathering of signatures initiated a referendum on that ordinance. So that referendum was held November 2nd. Now, because the antis had gathered signatures, the referendum was posed, should this ordinance be repealed? So a yes vote repealed the ordinance, a no vote essentially kept the ordinance. There were speakers from Colorado for Family Values that came into Lewiston. They aired television commercials asserting that gay and lesbian people were after your children, whether that be in the schoolyards or as teachers trying to recruit them somehow. This is the sort of messaging that you can buy with lots of money. This was the vote that was held there, and surprisingly, despite the good work of the coalition of all religious leaders in the city practically, and almost all the political leaders of the area, the ordinance was overwhelmingly rejected with a 68 to 32% majority yes, repeal the ordinance vote on November 2nd. And so that was one of 3 losses that we suffered this week, and also indicative of sort of money that is flowing from national religious right groups into these local areas.
I want to just add something, and that is to plug my other colleague's book here, Hostile Climate, which documents all of these local cases very well. Now here. The other thing I wanted to mention is that a very effective strategy in these campaigns is that at the last minute videos are brought in, videos full of outright lies, half lies, bizarre, twisted versions of the truth, and distributed sometimes literally at night onto people's doors. And so people get all this information and confused people panic. They're really, as Hans said, geared for people's fear, especially around their children.
I'm Joseph Powell. I'm from Maple Shores. We're right now facing a Cobb County-like ordinance in City County. The man who did his name is Dick Dickey, and he copied in that food. He copied the Cobb County ordinance word for word, substituting in alternative lifestyle. We are meeting tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We're building a coalition with a number of groups in the town. This is sort of a chance to do this again. What do you suggest?
Well, various people probably take this on, probably Hans more than me. First of all, I wanted to say that you'll get a chance to do this quite a bit more, because rumors have it that they're going to introduce a statewide initiative in January in the state legislature. So,
And 13 counties, correct?
and they're in 13 counties already. One of the things that we strongly suggest is to look at building the same type of broad-based coalition we built when we tried to pass a hate crimes law in this state. Now, I have to confess that 2 years in a row it was defeated, but the primary basis for its defeat was our insistence, which we never wavered on and never will, for including the protection of gays and lesbians in our hate crime law. But we were very successful in getting hundreds and hundreds of groups to endorse that concept. We also built a permanent Georgia Civil Rights Network out of that group that is continuing to work, even though it suffered those legislative defeats. And so my first suggestion would be to re-tap into that force and to not see your struggle as an isolated one, but build upon what has gone on before you. And I should also say that hate crimes was another very clear example of the racist nature of their agenda, using homophobia as the weapon.
I think some groups that you should consider talking to are arts groups, education groups, choice groups, African American civil rights groups, or civil rights groups in general, the National Organization for Women, if there's a local chapter there, if there's a Planned Parenthood office in the area. You might be able to consider going after, talk to the Democratic Party people, talk to business leaders, talk to civil liberties groups, and even Chamber of Commerce, I think would be a discussion that would be fruitful, especially if the county is going to become off limits to any sort of investment. That's a danger that poses to their agenda. Any other suggestions?
And take advantage of the fact that a lot of counties are competing for attention in the upcoming '96 Olympics. So this is really bad timing. I mean, this is a terrible time to get bad press, in a business sense. And you can take advantage of that.
I think clergy people should also, sort of, as broad a range of clergy people as you can, should be brought into this discussion very early on to prevent the sort of fragmentation and in some cases apathy that took place in Cobb.
I'm sorry to say we're going to have to stop with this. I know you have great questions. We're going to start getting, the next, after our break, is going to start getting a lot more local to what's going on in Georgia. I wanted also to say that at 3 o'clock this afternoon, there will be time for people to get into groups, and you may want to have a group about your county. It'll be a time to really start strategizing about who are the people to bring in and what do we need to do. So this isn't your only chance. That's hopefully is exactly what today is starting. Wait, you really want a break? How much are you willing to pay for it? This is what Roy told me to ask you. As you go out, you could contribute to the expenses for today. There are baskets at the doors, is that right?
And on your way out, if you'd like to pick up a free copy of the People for newsletter, it's right here. I encourage everyone to take at least one copy.